Hello, this is the chapter reading for An Enduring Love by Wareeze Woodson. Chapter 1. The crew of the Dragonster lowered the gangplank, readying the vessel for Latvian passengers to board. The creak of heavy ropes tying the ship to the dock rasped Rebecca's nerves, reminding her that soon Wareeze would sail back to England without her. Devastated by the thought of such a loss, and at such a time, she swallowed hard. How can I bear to let him leave me behind? Standing on the dock in the midday sun, she tried to hold back her sobs, and, for a moment, she feared her knees might give way. She clenched her jaw, trying to hold her emotion steady, and caught the lapels of Wareeze's finely tailored blue jacket with trembling fingers. A rising ocean breeze stirred his dark hair and swirled her skirts about her ankles as he placed his hand over hers. As she gazed into Wareeze's deep blue eyes, Georgie Weister's words intruded. Sudeth is almost believable when he claims undying devotion. I admire his talent. Her chest burned with apprehension, and she gulped a deep breath. What if Georgie is correct? Does Wareeze wish to abandon me as implied? Weister's sly innuendos and the sound of his mocking laughter circled in her mind, but she tried to push such negative thoughts aside. Guilt for allowing a moment of doubt to fester filled her with shame, but that, too, she brushed aside. No, I refuse to believe Wareeze would desert me. Although we have only been married a few months, his love is strong and will endure forever, as will mine. For the first time, doubt crawled into her head, impossible to completely deny. Why would an official of the Latvian government attempt to stir trouble with lies? It made no sense. Gazing into her husband's eyes, she tried to discern his motives, his true intentions, even to examine his very soul. Why am I allowing Georgie's remarks to disturb me now? I ignored the accusations before. I could not bring myself to even speak such suspicions aloud. Still, could Georgie be correct? Overwhelmed to the point of panic, she probed as deeply as possible. Although he seemed troubled, she could not fully read his expression. So choked, she could scarcely speak, she whispered, Wareeze. Wareeze gently squeezed her fingers. I'm loath to leave you so distressed and with your mother too ill to travel. I'd give much to be able to stay with you until she recovers completely. Comforted by his words, yet alarmed that he might take matters into his own hands, she gasped. Antagonizing Weister would help no one. No, I too wish you could remain, but as a diplomat, you must obey the call from your superiors in England. Officials have much power. I do not want to anger your government against our marriage. As to that, my government has no say. Placing his arm around her waist, he continued, I am married, and that's an end to it. He continued, he couldn't disguise the strain reflected in his eyes, even with his smile. Father is my main concern, not the government. With him on his deathbed, my mother is at her wit's end, trying to cope. I detest leaving you in Latvia, even for a few weeks, but I am compelled to return to England simply because my family needs me so desperately. Ni mans mīles, tev žāt. English, he commanded with a tender smile. Remember, you are half English, and every lovely inch of you is married to an Englishman. I said no. My darling, you must go. Wareeze does love me, as I knew. She exhaled a pent-up breath. How can I explain so he will understand? He must not set Weister against us, a fatal mistake. My mother wishes me to sail with you now, but I cannot leave her alone when she is so ill. If only I could. I must be strong for all concerned. That would be unsettling for both of you. Much as I wish otherwise, stay with her. He ran one finger down the bridge of her nose and smiled. With your gentle care, the doctor assured me she should be completely recovered in a few weeks, barring complications. I've booked passage for both of you 1 month from today. Wareeze grimaced, and a fierce scowl furrowed his brow. Blister it. With the continued unrest rumbling across Latvia, concern pulls me to remain by her side. Yet, I long to see my father one final time. Dash it all, I do not half trust that Weister chap either. Government official or no, always lurking, his gaze constantly on you. A chill raced down her spine. I am a married woman. What could Weister possibly do? All will be well. I will remain in my mother's house, after all. Go in safety. Brave words. I hope my beliefs are correct. If only she could continue holding him in her arms, garner his strength, that would sustain her. But here, on the dockside, time had slipped away. She shaped his face with her hands, attempting to firm her voice, but it cracked all the same. I want you to sail, to visit your father before it is too late. It is difficult for you to leave. It is even harder for me to watch you go, but I wish you to comfort your mother in this time of trouble. Besides, my mother and I will join you in 1 month, no more. Lifting her chin with one finger, he gazed into her eyes. Leaving you behind, awash in tears, is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. But I'll be waiting. Rise continued to search her features as if probing to the depth of her soul. Would you feel more secure if I returned for you and your mother? Tempted to tell him yes, she resisted and shook her head, but her confidence in him had returned tenfold. She caught her breath. Sir Soodith, the tide is about to turn, a sailor called from the end of the gangplank. Rise kissed Rebecca quickly on the lips. Remember how much I love you. I'll be waiting for you in England. I will follow with my mother in 1 month, I promise. Rebecca insisted and wiped away her tears. I want him to stay. The power to persuade him is mine, but I must not use it. He still hesitated, but finally sighed, his gaze clouded with resignation. I've transferred most of your funds to England, so you'll have no concern on that head. But I've left enough for your needs until you sail. Here are the bookings for you and your mother. Lowering his head, he placed the papers in her hands and whispered, You will rest in my heart until I see you again. And you in mine, she breathed, and she watched him board the ship. Rebecca stood alone on the dock, devastated by the crushing blow of his departure. She dabbed her gloved fingers at the corner of her eyes, while the cry of seagulls echoed the pain in her heart. Rise stood on the rail, his heart beating heavily enough to choke him. He found he had to fight the urge to abandon ship and rejoin his wife, standing on the dockside. How could he bear to leave her in Latvia, waiting for her mother to recover while he sailed away? How could he not? In his view, the sting at the back of his eyes and the burning in his nose as his gaze lingered on his beautiful wife wasn't manly, but at the moment he didn't care. From his vantage point, as the ship got underway, he could see her soft, sherry brown eyes staring at him. Her lovely golden brown hair gleamed with copper glints in the sun, as strands whipped in the ocean breeze. Impatient with himself, he blinked several times to clear his vision and gave one swipe at his nostrils. He maintained his position at the rail, staring at the spot where she stood until he could no longer see the shoreline. The sun sank low in the sky before he forced himself to move. With one last desperate gaze toward where the land receded from his view, he turned and with reluctant steps headed to his cabin. Rebecca's reticule bumped against her side when she pulled the brim of her bonnet lower to obstruct the curious perusals of the stragglers remaining on the quay. A sea breeze carried the odor of fish from the fleet of boats that bobbed against the pilings of the dock, and almost snatched her breath away while rolling her stomach. Shouts of men high in the riggings of a ship sounded at the edge of her consciousness, but her attention remained on the tiny dot at the horizon where the gray-green of the water blended with the blue of the sky. With a lump in her throat, Rebecca continued to gaze at the dark spot of the sails as the ship carried Rise away. While she stood watching, the sun sunk a bit lower, but she continued to stare at that dot. A seagull momentarily swooped, blocking her vision on the ship. Much to her despair, when the bird flew on, the last of the sails had disappeared. With a heavy heart, she turned toward the rutted lane. Under her breath, she railed against an unkind fate that had dragged Rise from her when she needed his strength the most. Hesitating, she wiped another tear away and glanced back at the sea. Not wanting to add to his burden, she deliberately withheld the knowledge that she carried his child. With a deep case of the dismissals engulfing her, she wished she'd revealed her condition to him. Being noble has its rewards, but now it feels lonely. Rebecca lifted her chin and squared her shoulders. She could manage. After all, she would follow, one day soon. But now she must face the future without his support, and she stumbled in her haze of tears. 3 months later, after the demise of his father, Lord Wareeze, Earl of Blankenshire, strode into the building housing the diplomatic corps and made his way to his chief's office. As he paced down the hall, his mind whirled, searching for the reason Sir Gerald Williams had called for his face-to-face consultation. He thought he knew. He'd been so caught up in the aftermath of his father's death and all that it entailed, he had neglected his other duties. Perhaps the meeting had to do with his most troubling concern, Rebecca. Although he wrote to her several times, he never received a single letter in reply, certainly a cause for deep concern. Wareeze requested permission to return to Latvia. He must collect his wife. Apprehension scraped along his nerves, sending agitation through his entire body, and he drew a sharp breath. She must have run into some sort of trouble and needed his help. Still, the returned letters had been unopened, and he clenched his fist against what that might mean. Feasibly, Sir Williams would grant his request, and his spirits brightened. He straightened his shoulders and hurried forward. Sir William's secretary ushered Wareeze into the inner office. The chief glanced up and laid his papers aside. Motioning to a chair across the desk from him, he invited, "Welcome, Sudith. Sit." Wareeze dropped into the seat indicated and gazed at the chief. Troubled by the stern expression on Sir William's face, he drew a deep breath and waited. The chief met his gaze without speaking for a long moment. "I received an answer to your request to return to Latvia. I'm afraid the Latvian authorities have refused to allow you back into the country." "For what possible reason?" Stunned, he inched to the edge of his seat. Sir Williams cleared his throat. "Seems the powers that be didn't like it when you married a Latvian citizen without permission." "But I had her mother's permission when I married her." Wareeze clenched his jaw. "Her mother is a British citizen." "That may be, but it's your wife's citizenship that is in question. Born and raised in that country and with a Latvian father makes the matter clear." "This is preposterous," Wareeze grumbled. "Rebecca is my wife. I'll slip into the country as a private citizen. That way our government can't be held responsible." Silence descended on the room, and the atmosphere crackled with tension. Sir William's frown deepened. Sir Williams frowned down at his fingernails and grimaced. "There's more. It saddens me to inform you that both your wife and mother-in-law are deceased." "What?" Wareeze couldn't have heard properly. No, Rebecca couldn't be dead, not his beautiful wife, so young, so vibrant, and so innocent. For a moment, everything in the room faded. He shook his head. "The death certificates were sent with a denial of your request." "No, there must be some mistake. I must go to Latvia and locate my wife. Perhaps her mother did perish, and some official thought it was Rebecca." Putting a hand to his chest to calm the rapid beating of his heart, he inhaled deeply. "She can't be dead." "I've made inquiries. Double-checked, as it were. There's no mistake. Rebecca and her mother both are certainly deceased." Sir William said in a voice filled with sympathy. Wareeze rose to his feet, his jaw working. He refused to accept Rebecca's death. But what if it was true? How could he allow his wife's remains to stay buried in a foreign country? He needed to visit her grave, to pray over her, and perhaps even talk to her when things overwhelmed him. Wareeze needed to see her burial box, at least to know this was real and not merely a nightmare. "Then I must be allowed to recover her body." "Not possible. I've tried to retrieve the bodies, but without success." "I can't accept that as final. Somehow I must claim her remains." Sir Williams gained his feet and straightened. "You have other obligations. Your siblings and your mother need you more than ever since your father's death." He came around the desk and placed his hand on Wareze's shoulder. "Don't throw your life away on a useless undertaking. A casket full of bones will profit you nothing. Sorrow has you in its grip, but be the sensible fellow I know you to be and accept what can't be changed." He glanced down at his hand where a tear had dripped, and his shoulders began to shake. The chief turned and strode to the door. "I'll be in the other room," Sir William said. Rise fell into the chair, folded his arms beneath his head on the desk, and heaved with sorrow. None of this is true. His chest squeezed, and he fought for each breath. Finally, he mopped his face and walked out of the office, out of the building, and out of the life he inhabited, into a future of a desolate existence filled with sorrow. The whole world had darkened while he'd been inside the building, and he didn't expect it to lighten ever again. Thank you.